So you're looking to level Rogue, or maybe you're not happy with your current leveling build on Rogue. I've got something for you. Since the start of Diablo 4's first season, Season of a Malignant, about 30 hours ago, I've been playing nothing but Rogue, and my build of choice is Poison-focused Penetrating Shot. Not only does this feel really good, but as you can see from the gameplay footage, it's performing quite well. I'm level 65, taking down level 79 monsters, meaning not only do I get optimal EXP, I'm also kind of a certified badass, or maybe just an edgelord. I'll let you decide down in the comments. Rogue stereotypes aside, I'm going to get straight into a little bit on how the build works. Then I'll cover some of my skill choices, Paragon points, though I'm not too far into that yet, and of course itemization, and after that get into a little bit more about my experiences with the build. So starting off, this is a combo point build, meaning you have to build up combo points with a generator and then spend them with a core skill. In my case, Fundamental Puncture is my generator, I want to use that 3 times, and then my spender is of course Penetrating Shot, which fires a powerful arrow that pierces through enemies. With the trick shot aspect, that arrow sends a bunch of smaller arrows off to the side that also do lots and lots of damage. More arrows, more damage. Pretty simple concept. This means that you're essentially waltzing through enemies. 1, 2, 3, fire. 1, 2, 3, fire. 1, 2, 3, fire. And that's about as musical as I'll ever be. Now, the other skills that are used rotationally are Shadow Imbuement and Poison Imbuement. Ideally, if you get lucky, Poison Imbuement is something that you use 100% of the time. It's just up, and you don't think about it. Most of the time is not the ideal time, which means on a pack, you'll open with Shadow Imbuement, 1, 2, 3, Penetrating Shot, 1, 2, 3, Penetrating Shot, and then your Imbuement runs out, but it's still on cooldown, so you swap to Poison, repeat until you either run out of both Imbuments, in which case, unfortunately, you may have to fire off a Penetrating Shot without an Imbuement, or you get a Bursting Venoms proc, a legendary aspect, which not only resets Poison Imbuement, but also means that you can essentially fire it infinitely by sitting in a Poison Puddle. As a note, while this is a lucky hit procs very quickly on Penetrating Shot. It can get over 100% with just a little bit of chance. Plus, you're hitting a whole bunch of different enemies, meaning your chance of proccing when firing into a pack feels pretty darn close to 100%. So on single target, sometimes I run out of imbues, other times I get lucky. On AoE, I pretty much have infinite Poison Imbue, and in fact, that's kind of gotten me into a bad habit of using Poison Imbue a little more than I should when I need to swap to Shadow, because Shadow Imbue infects enemies with damage that explodes when they're killed, or deals damage directly to the enemy when it expires. These explosions are great for wiping out entire packs, which is why it's your ideal opener. Dash is used for mobility to get around the map faster, and Shadow Step is used to break CCs. You become unstoppable and backstab an enemy, also stunning them. There's good news and bad news here. The good news is that you get a nice burst of movement speed, and Shadow Step feels really good when you can target an enemy. The bad news is you need to target an enemy. So sometimes I find myself getting CC'd, and in that split-second window where I need to un-CC myself, otherwise I'm going to die, I don't, because I misclick, or because the enemy moved, or because for whatever reason it just doesn't go off. I think it might have a range or something. This, in comparison to my Sorceress, which had multiple CC breaks, is surprisingly frustrating, though every other aspect of a build feels great, so I guess it's a small price to pay. Now last but not least, an important thing to remember about Penetrating Shot is its power scales off of density, meaning you don't want to pull just one enemy at a time and kill it. If you're doing that, I suggest going rapid fire instead. You want to hit a whole group of enemies. Any dungeon, such as Immortal Emanation, that's known for having large groups, is ideal for this task, though watch out for Suppressor, which is particularly effective at screwing this build over. Also, don't be afraid to get up in the face of enemies and bully them. I find quite often I'm able to keep an enemy CC'd until it dies, or at the very least is poisoned to death, and I can run away safely laughing as it dies behind me. Furthermore, I have enough shadows up from Darktrop, at least most of the time, that I'm not too fussed about getting into the face of most enemies. Though of course, like with all things, it should be done in moderation. Know your limits, and know when an enemy is about to become unstoppable. That's where they get really, really dangerous. With that said, let's move on to talking about the skills, gear, and Paragon. So first up, Puncture with Fundamental Puncture. Now Puncture has 3 blades, making it pretty much impossible to miss, and hitting with at least 2 blades, very easy on bosses or if you're pretty much in melee range, means that you make them vulnerable for 2 seconds. Overall, this is a great source of vulnerable and a really good generator. Now coming down here, I've got Penetrating Shot with as many ranks as possible, going into Advanced Penetrating Shot for extra CC. While in theory the crit would be good, I didn't find it to be particularly necessary. And overall, I'd want that crit on bosses, not trash, which is where you don't actually get it. Next up, I've got 3 points in Siphoning Strikes. So far, I'm not 100% sure on this. Healing is quite good, and it's certainly very effective when hitting a large pack. Unfortunately, it is a lucky hit, and it doesn't necessarily always proc on single target. Though, when you're hitting a ton of different enemies, Penetrating Shot has a base lucky hit of 50%, and that lucky hit chance goes up by another 30 with 3 combo points for a total of 80. I'm also grabbing ranks in Stutter Step because while leveling, it's really handy to move faster. Then coming down here, I've got Shadow Step and Methodical to stun enemies. I find this to be quite good for stunning enemies out of their special attacks. Weapon Mastery for, well, right now it's a little bit of increased damage to vulnerable enemies, but ideally I should have a crossbow for crit strike damage. More on that in the gearing section. We've got Dash. It's a really good movement skill, and I'm going all the way into Disciplined Dash. Not 100% sure if this is worth. I could probably reclaim a point and put it elsewhere. At a minimum, though, Enhanced Dash is great because then enemies take 15% more critical strike damage. Coming down here, gotta have Malice. If anything, I could probably take a point out of here and into Exploit. Plus, I've got 3 ranks into Dark Shroud. Right now, I'm also using Subverting for increased movement speed instead of countering for increased critical strike chance. When I was having energy issues, I instead had a couple of points into Consuming Shadows, but right now I don't feel like it's necessary, so I grabbed Debilitating Toxins for a few more defenses. I'm running 1 point in Shadow Imbuement since this is mostly just a clear skill, and 5 points in Poison Imbuement since this is a bulk of my single target damage. I am, after all, a Poison Rogue using Blended Poison Imbuement. Now coming down to the ultimate skills, Innervation solved all of my energy problems, the lucky hit procs quite frequently, and Haste is really good. While you're at higher energy, you gain movement speed, while you're at lower energy, you gain attack speed. So after firing Penetrating Shot, my generator's a little faster, which makes the build feel much more responsive. Last but not least, I've got Precision. Crit strikes with marksman skills grant precision, 4% increased crit damage per stack up to 20. When you reach 5, the final hit is an auto crit. Ideally, you always want this to be Penetrating Shot. I'm honestly not the best at playing around that style, which is why I've considered dropping it for something else. That said, I don't know if, for example, picking up Victimize, dropping Shadow Imbuement entirely, and picking up Death Trap is a good idea. I do plan to try it out at some point in the future. I don't think Close Quarters is the way. I don't think Momentum is the way. And as for Exposure, well, if I'm taking Death Trap anyway, maybe this is exactly the way to do it. I'll have to try both of those at some point soon. Now, coming over to my Paragon board quickly, I don't have any level 15 Glyphs because I split my EXP. Very bad idea, don't do that. But in the first board, I've got Combat with 25 Intelligence. That way, when a skill critically strikes, I get a little bit of energy cost back, but really it's mostly for the crit damage because crit damage is very good, especially when you have auto crit. Coming up here, I grabbed the Eldritch Bounty node. Eldritch Bounty is 20% more damage because my skills are almost always imbued. And then down here, I've got Tracker for poisoning damage effects last 33% longer. In other words, 33% more damage with poison against bosses. Plus, the damage bonus doesn't say poison damage, it says damage to poisoned enemies. Should this be something like Exploit? Maybe, but I found it rather difficult to fit Exploit in here, as opposed to the intelligence requirement for Tracker. As I get more level 15 Glyphs, I do think it will become easier, and it should be mentioned that different boards support different things. For example, here, it's very easy to socket in either Strength or Dexterity, but Intelligence will be much harder. So my next board, No Witnesses, is going to have probably Exploit. And that will not only give me an extra vulnerable source, but it's going to give me a nice boost to damage as well. That's right over here. Support Strength, so I'll have to get the Strength nodes, and you can see those just like this. Now, last but not least, when it comes to gear, I'm level 65. I basically just got into World Tier 4 and started farming. I haven't even replaced all of my sacred items, so don't take these as the best in slot stuff. It's more of what I've got right now, and some of it isn't very good. Also, some of it's recently replaced, literally as of this dungeon, which is why I don't have full sockets and everything, and I also don't have gems and everything. So I've got an Umbrous Helmet, Lucky Hit, chance to gain Dark Shroud. This way, not only do I not need Dark Shroud on my bar, but I have a nice defensive. Then Lucky Hit while I have Barrier, as far as I know, isn't very active because I don't really have barrier generation sources. I could try Temerity Pants. That would probably make me too squishy. Cooldown's good and armor's good. I just saw one good stat, happened to roll another in a couple tries and said, you know what, good enough. Long term, I think I want things like life, cooldown reduction, armor, and maybe imbue skill levels. I'm pretty sure those roll here. On my chest piece, I've got a pretty decent disobedience. Then reduce damage from distant, control impair reduction, help counter that CC a little, reduction from enemies that are poisoned, and total armor. Go for defensive stats on your chest. The exact ones don't matter too much. On gloves, anything with penetrating shot plus 4 ranks is good. I happen to get a really good pair of gloves, crit strike chance, attack speed, and trap cooldown. This is part of why I'm considering trying a death trap variant of this, or maybe a poison trap variant. Then I've got this pair of pants. I threw a pretty crappy aspect on it. I really want a different aspect for damage reduction when I use a basic skill. I haven't found a good one, so I'm just going to keep fishing. But damage reduction and armor's good. Life would be good. These aren't very good. I'm going to replace them soon. Boots, it has energy cost reduction, which is why I'm using them. This was an experiment. I tried these for the last 3 or 4 dungeons to see if I can get away with not having movement speed on my boots. And as it turns out on Rogue, you can, but you really should have movement speed anyway. So I'm probably going to swap back to my old ones soon. They had movement speed and no other useful stats. Next up, my bow. It is an 815 item power bow. I wanted a crossbow, but my crossbow was 710 item power, and 815 is just a lot of base damage. When I get a better crossbow, I'll use it. I have another Edge Masters, so I'm not too worried about that. And the stats here, damage to poison is pretty good, damage to crowd control is pretty good, damage to vulnerable. I mean, overall, this is a good item that's just on the wrong base type, so it's kind of perfect for my current stage. My amulet, also pretty darn good. I have movement speed, energy cost reduction, and cooldown reduction, so I can just spam my skills without really worrying about cost. I might even have a little bit more energy cost reduction than I need, and instead I'll want something like cooldown reduction on imbue skills, or maybe a passive skill for some more damage. I put corruption on here because I happen to have a really well rolled one, and enemies are very often vulnerable. I'm almost always imbuing my skills, so it seemed like a really good way to combo things. Long term, I'm definitely going to replace it with something that's just more direct damage. For now, though, it's really good. And again, when you're leveling, beggars can't be choosers. I'd rather save some of my really good aspects for a perfect amulet that I'll roll later. This ring is trash, but it had a blue socket that I could put my defensive heart in. I'm using a brutal heart, absorbing about 20% of incoming damage for an explosion when I use my subterfuge skills. The rest of the ring is absolute garbage. Look for crit damage, anything aside of this, really. Oh, also, it was just a place to store one of my bursting venoms. The crit strikes with poison imbued skills have a 10% chance to create a toxic pool that deals damage. The damage isn't really relevant. What's relevant is you can stand in a pool and just spam poison imbuement, which is really good and makes the build feel great. Then I've got my other ring with resource gen, life, crit chance. Crit chance is really easy to roll. Try to roll it on your rings. Aside of that, it's a pretty good place for my lucky hit stun grenade heart. I know that might not seem very good. The damage does not scale very high, but continually stunning enemies has been surprisingly effective, especially since I'm using a wrathful heart in my amulet for increased 2 damage over time against crowd controlled targets and also against staggered bosses. That said, I'm considering swapping over to the imbuement heart, a 15% chance to apply all 3 imbuements on my skills. The thing I want to know is A, does this override any imbuements I've applied myself? And B, does it stack with them? If it stacks and doesn't override, really good. If it doesn't, really bad. I also tried a badly rolled Barber. That didn't feel very good with this build because I went from 2-shotting stuff to the thing absorbing damage and not dying. Though in high-end content, if you're pushing, Barber would be incredible. So that probably means eventually I'll just have an amulet swap or whatever slot. Then my weapons, I've got a random weapon that I picked up that happened to have good stats. I'll replace it at some point. These are stat sticks. The damage doesn't matter, so the item power doesn't matter. And then Condemnation. This dagger is really, really good. First of all, 40% more damage when spending 3 combo points, which I'm always doing when firing Penetrating Shot. So that's a really strong legendary aspect. Second of all, the overall stats on it not necessarily terrible, but not great. Third of all, basic skills have a 30% chance to generate 3 combo points, meaning instead of going 1, 2, 3, I go 1, 3, penetrating shot, 1, 2, penetrating shot, 1, 2, 3, penetrating shot, etc., etc. More penetrating shots, all fired at 3 combo points. And so that has been my build playing Rogue so far. As you could tell from the I'm using this for now, it's not very good, and the item is probably junk. I've been swapping out my gear a lot, especially since I just hit World Tier 4. However, the build's performance has been incredibly solid. I can take on Nightmare Dungeon 25s, which contain enemies that are level 79. I'm 65, so they're 14 levels higher than myself, which I'd say is pretty darn good. And it means that if I were a level 100 character, and I'm sure as I level up, finish off my renown grind, and get a few other key upgrades, my damage is going to go up even more. Of course, as my gear gets better, I'm going to focus more on legendary aspects that directly increase my damage, with a special eye for multiplicative effects. I'm also going to look for a few better defensive bonuses, since a lot of things like the arrow storms are just legendary aspects that I threw on for now, because why not, and I had it, I wasn't going to use it for anything else. It's useful compared to just wearing the rare. I'm not particularly advocating for a lot of those long term. But it's also important to remember that while looking at a best in slot list is well and good, and if you want to look at a best in slot list for this build, you can check out Dioxide's guide over on Maxroll. His isn't super focused on poison, so there are a few small differences, but overall versus his and mine, his is really well tested and actually polished, incredibly well written guide. My penetrating shot setup is just trash off a floor that happens to be working. So if there's a difference, go with his and I'll let you know if mine's good later. Speaking of, if you want to find out if mine does end up becoming good, get subscribed. Maybe leave a like while you're down there, because I'm going to be talking about this build at least once more in the future. With that said, I'm curious, how have your experiences been so far with Season 1, Season of a Malignant? My Rogue's been great, I really enjoy playing the build, but personally I find the seasonal content to be a little lacking. I was really hoping for an endgame activity or something that was, well, a game changer. Instead, it's Diablo 4, it's still a solid game, but nothing's changed that much, so I probably won't be playing the season for nearly as long as I did the preseason. And be sure to let me know your thoughts down below. With that said, if you're looking for something else to watch, there's a recommendation on screen right now. And maybe you haven't been keeping up with all the updates that Blizzard did, such as their campfire chat. Link to that will be up above, along with a couple other things like my thoughts on some awesome indie games, and the original version of this build that I used from level 1 to 50, along with some early theory crafting I did and then swapped away from later. Before I go, a special thanks to my patrons and channel members for the continued support. For as little as $1 a month, you can help make videos just like this one possible. Link to support is down below. And with that said, congratulations on making it to the end, thanks for watching, and I'll see you again sometime soon.